In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to make your drawings look more three-dimensional. Now, the most important thing to think about first is how three-dimensionality works in reality, and specifically what role our eyes play in that. Now, the eye functions almost identically to an aperture on a camera does, and that is that, like the aperture, the eye will contract or expand depending on the amount of light that is hitting it, in order to compensate for the over or under exposure that it is experiencing. In nature, however, there is a much more vibrant range of values than our eye is able to perceive, and this would range all the way from a black hole all the way to peering directly into the sun from a centimeter away. And our eye is not able to compensate for that extreme amount of exposure. And so within that maximum potential of value range, our visual potential is much more compressed. The darkest shadow of just pure black, it would be the darkest visual potential that we have, and the brightest visual potential would be the lightest light that we can see before it just gets completely washed out and white and completely devours and consumes the form. Because our eyes are just like the aperture on a camera, our eyes cannot simultaneously have the aperture close to the smallest amount, allowing us to perceive the full range of dark values, and open to the largest amount to perceive the full range of light values simultaneously. There has to be one or the other, or some variation between the two. And we see this in reality from when we are inside the house and it's light out and it's dark outside and we can't see anything outside, it is pitch black, and vice versa when we're outside in the dark and we look into the light of a home, it is almost washed out because it is so bright. And the reason for that is because our aperture in our eyes are adjusted for the environment that we are in, and we cannot have an aperture, two different apertures going at once. And this is an issue that a lot of people run into issues with when they are trying to draw three-dimensionally, is they accidentally or unconsciously have the drawing exist in a reality where there are several apertures open, and it makes the drawing look really gray because there's no hierarchy of value and there's no defined tonal range. So let me explain more specifically what I mean by this. It is very common in a drawing, especially with people who are just starting to draw, to focus on one area of the drawing for extended periods of time. And if you are trying to draw something three-dimensionally and you have, let's just say, a figure, for example, that has areas of shadow, areas of highlight, and areas of transitional midtones, and if you are focusing for extended periods of time just looking at the shadows, then your eyes are going to adjust to that, and you're going to be able to develop a hierarchy range within that shadow, and you're going to be able to have the darkest of the shadow all the way to the lightest of the shadow. But that hierarchy range is not going to be calibrated in terms of the whole drawing, but just in this specific shadow area. And so what's going to happen is once you are moved out of the shadow area and you go into the light area and you spend an extended amount of times in that area, your eyes are going to get adjusted to that environment, and you will begin to divide the highlights or the lighter areas of the drawing and have a value range separate from that of the shadow. And if you do this for the entire drawing and have several different value ranges going at once, you're going to find that there are certain values that overlap. And what I mean by that is that there will be the light areas of a shadow that might coexist with the same value as the dark areas of the lights. And this is a big issue because it destroys the hierarchy and the ability for you to perceive what is falling into the shadow and what is falling into the light. It is very unclear of what that specific value is doing because it exists in the shadow on one area of the drawing, but that same value exists in the highlight of another. And that will make your drawing look extremely gray, extremely flat, and there is impossible to make your drawing look 3D because that is impossible to exist in reality. In reality, we have a specific value range, and everything is related to that. And so it's not that a specific value always exists in the light or in the dark, but when you establish your range of values on your drawing, each value needs to have a placement, and that placement either has to be in the lights or in the darks. It is crucial to establish a successful value range early on in your drawing, as soon as you have completed a block-in and have divided the drawing from the lights and the darks. The range of your values are going to depend almost entirely on what material you're using. So with graphite or pencils, you have a lot more limited range on what you're capable of achieving, and that is fine. That has nothing to do with making an object look three-dimensional. It just means that you're going to have to be aware of that compression that is taking place from the diverse value range that you're seeing from the limited value range that you are capable of achieving with the resources that you have. Now, graphite is probably one of the more limited value range. I would say silver point is even probably a little bit more, but graphite is up there. And then charcoal, you have a lot more value range. You're able to get a lot more darker with charcoal. And so that gives you more value range if you're wanting to have a little more freedom in that aspect. And then even more than charcoal would be paints. You can get, paints are the most intense variety of value ranges that we have, and that's why the oil painters of the past and a lot of the artists in the past and present too keep drawings for studies for the paintings, because in paintings you can get so much more variety than you can get with pencils. And pencils are great on their own, but you have to be aware of their limitations to use them to your advantage. And there are a couple of ways that artists have used these tools and have been able to extend their value range. And one way to do that is to draw on a toned paper. And that allows you, with graphite and charcoal, to be able to build up and get a tone really, really dark for the shadows, but then you can also switch and use white chalk or some form of white dry media to build on to add to the lights, and that will give you a much larger value range than just building up on white and only going in one direction. Now let's go back and talk more about compression, and specifically relating it to the bark drawing I'm currently working on. As you can see in the reference on the right, the background is slightly lighter than that of the paper I'm using on the left. In addition, the darkest darks in the shadow on the reference are darker than what I can achieve using the graphite pencils. Now, I did this on purpose to accomplish a variety of different tasks. The most obvious would be to practice working from life and mimic the compression that I would have to do while working with 3D models using a limited medium. In addition, I wanted to focus on giving the illusion of light that is identical and have that be the significance over achieving the identical values of the Bargue. And so what makes a drawing look 3D is the way that it represents light and how light falls and flows around the object. That is what makes something look 3D in reality. It's what makes it look 3D the way we perceive it, and it's what makes a drawing look three-dimensional. And the way that light falls on an object is dependent on the form itself, and a form that recedes back away from the light will be dark and have a more abrupt darkness that has less transition between the light and the dark. And this gives the feeling that it is more of a drastic change, more like a cube versus an apple, which would be a more subtle change. And what is very important in achieving the sense of light is the color, or the tone gradation between the different values. And so if you can copy or mimic the relation between the dark and the halftones and have the increments between the two similar, even though the darkest dark is not as dark and the lightest light might not be as light, you can still achieve the sense of three-dimensionality. So to sum up what that would look like, it would be taking all the values in reality that are equal and darker than that you can achieve using the medium that you have, and compressing it all into a single value. Equally, it would be looking at reality and anything that is equal or lighter to the lightest value you can achieve, and compressing that all down to a single value. What this allows you to do is to turn the form in everything that exists between those two hierarchical value ranges. And by copying this identically to how you perceive it in reality, it will turn the form and give it the sense of three-dimensionality. In addition to compression of values, line quality is another really important topic that is often overlooked by many artists. Edge quality or line quality has to do with the contours of your drawing and how they relate to one another. Objects that appear closer to you will have typically a more sharper line quality, and in addition, objects that are farther back and receding away will have a more fuzzy or blurred line quality. Now, it is important to look at your model or your reference and to see what the line quality is doing, and certain areas where there's a really abrupt drop-off or turnaround, it could be really sharp, and objects where there's really a gradual change, but it's still part of the contour, might be a little softer. Now, an important rule of thumb to pay attention to is that your shadow line will never be sharper than a contour line, and respecting this hierarchy will drastically help improve your drawings. One last concept I want to talk about is not directly about drawing three-dimensional, but rather drawing accurately in general. This is a common misconception that I've experienced, and I've seen a lot of my fellow peers and other people that I've worked with go through also, and that is that once you get past a single stage, you're never done with that stage, but you're always coming back to that stage in addition to moving forward. And it doesn't matter what your stages are, whether they be a block-in stage and then getting into dividing shadows, lights, and darks, whatever it is that takes you from a beginning of a drawing to an end of a drawing, you need to always remember to go back to those early stages where you're working with large proportions, because humans, we are not made to see large proportions. We are hyperactive, hypersensitive to seeing minute details and small changes around us, and we are extremely good at seeing details. But when it comes to these large proportions, we have a hard time distinguishing them and judging them independently from a series of small details. And a lot of people try to skip through these early block-in and working with proportions by using grids or tracing, and what that really does is it just cheats your brain from learning this way of being able to perceive your drawing with larger proportions instead of just the small proportions, and it can make your drawing feel really disconnected, and it's not drawing. You're skipping the fundamental parts of the drawing. And what I see is a lot of people will go through those stages and they'll say, okay, I got a drawing blocked in, that's good, I'm going to move to start dividing the lights and the darks. But then they think that once they finish that stage, it's like a level in a video game where once you finish it, you never have to go back. It's done. You're moving forward. It's in the past. It's experience that you have that you don't have to go back to. But in reality, going into a different stage or progressing further into the drawing, you are allowing yourself to have more context to be able to see your drawing and judge it more accurately. And when you start adding these more subtle variations and slight changes that you are more designed to be able to see better, you can start to see how things aren't working or things aren't piecing together quite right. And by going back to these earlier stages, you can resolve that. And you will never get the block-in stage perfectly accurate because you have no context for it. When you're blocking in something, you have zero context whatsoever, and going further into the drawing, you're slowly adding more context to your drawing. It is just like a book where with no context, the reality of what you're reading can change drastically. And so something that feels right at the earlier stages could turn out to be maybe right, but most likely needing changes. And so once you get those contexts in or around your drawing, going back to that earlier stages and working up through there is essential to making a drawing that reads well and is extremely accurate. What I do and what I've been doing for this drawing is every day, the first hour I'm working on this Bargue, is that I'm going back to the earlier stages, because if you can't go back to the earlier stages and correct that, then there's no way of knowing that what you're adding onto it is valid, is any good, because if the foundations, if the structures aren't correct, anything you add onto it even if it's relating fine, will be incorrect, inaccurate if you're going, and that's what you should be going for. Learning to draw accurately is having a drawing not accurate would be not what you're going for, obviously. And so going back to these and finding that structure is essential to building a drawing up and finishing it and getting into that final stage where you are able to push it as far as you possibly can. Because once you get the very last day I'm working on this, I am still going back and making corrections to the contours. It's something that I never outgrow. You never outgrow. You're always going back to it. And the more practice you have with it, the more accurate you will be first pass through, and the more accurate you'll be in perceiving that difference between where your drawing is and where it should be. And that is ultimately extremely crucial and very misunderstood conception of what different stages of the drawing are that will really boost your drawing from being able to go back and really dive back into those basic necessities that make the drawing a good drawing.